As I greet you, it's great to be with you again after a rather long pause. Started the new year and spent some time overseas, but it's back to our regular cycle, which means an interview with Freedom of Religion South Africa. Freedom of Religion South Africa is an organization which exists to protect your right to religious freedom in South Africa. And this morning, I'm chatting to Michael Swain. Michael Swain is the executive director for the organization. Michael, that's the formal introduction, but it's always good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. Always great to be with you and everyone who's watching.
So, Michael, today, back in the news, I have noticed that the CRL, the Rights Commission, is back in the news, back into the news cycle. And from you, I heard that there's been some rumblings. There's been a little bit of progression in terms of the CRL and their interactions with the church community in particular. And so I'd love us to talk again, unfortunately, about the regulation of religion in South Africa and all matters around it. Thanks for your time. You're a subject matter expert on this, in that you have been engaged with the CRL and the state for years and years and years now. And so as we enter into this next cycle, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say on what's going on.
No, thank you, Mark. And unfortunately, this thing is back. In the words of the newly reappointed CRL chair, Mrs. Tukum Kolazi Khaluva, this is back on the table squarely, and it's not business as usual around churches anymore, according to her interview. So yes, unfortunately, we're facing this matter again, which is, of course, really problematic because, as you know, this is not a new thing. It went through a 4-year process. There were 5 days of hearings at Parliament, at the end of which Parliament actually rejected the proposals of the CRL to regulate religion through peer review mechanisms and other ways. So why are we here again? That's the very concerning question. But here we are, and we have to obviously face what we're dealing with.
Well, Michael, maybe we can just start with the reasons that have given by the CRL to support their call for the state regulation of religion. What case are they calling on the church to answer?
Well, one of the things that they are obviously always pointing to, and in their original report that they produced on this, which is called The Commercialization of Religion and the Abuse of People's Belief Systems, they highlighted many of the really bad things that were happening by a very tiny fringe minority of the faith community. You might remember the prophet of doom who sprayed insecticide in the face of somebody and said God was going to heal her. You may recall the snake eaters and the grass eaters and the petrol drinkers and that kind of thing. And they, of course, use that and the media hype that surrounds it to say, this is prevalent, it's happening everywhere, and we need to regulate it. And of course, the answer is no, it's not happening everywhere. The vast majority of the faith community do a wonderful job serving their communities, being a vital part of the social fabric of this society. But they believe that what they should now be given, the CRL, i.e. the state, because the CRL Rights Commission is an institution of state, is the power to control by regulation and therefore to decide effectively who should or should not be allowed to practice as a religious practitioner, a pastor, an imam, a rabbi or whatever, or run or open a religious organization. And of course, one of the things that they point out to are all these terribly shocking things that are happening. But here's the truth. Every single one of them is dealt with by existing South African law, often criminal law. And the problem is that these laws are simply not being properly enforced or maybe enforced at all, whether that's capacity or political will. But that's not the point. The point is that the laws exist to actually stop that very behavior. And by the way, when they have been enforced, as was the case, for example, in the Prophet of Doom, he was convicted. I think he even got a jail sentence as a consequence of that, because that was simply an assault. You cannot ever hide a criminal activity behind your so-called right to religious freedom. A crime is a crime is a crime. If you're a pastor, a policeman, a politician, and you break the law must deal with you. And after due process, if you're found guilty, then yes, go to jail. But that is not a reason to say suddenly we must now regulate and license every single religious practitioner. If they're not able to enforce existing criminal laws, why would we possibly believe that by having this extra huge layer of unnecessary regulation, somehow that's going to stop a random crazy minority doing crazy things? It won't. It's always happened. It always will happen. And it's just a way, we believe, for the state to gain control over the religious sector. And that, by the way, is the death of religious freedom. If you can, or if the state can, more specifically, control who can, who cannot preach, if the CRL is what they wanted to be, which was the final arbiter and final decision maker in the religious sector about doctrine and everything else, then you've effectively lost your religious freedom. The state then controls what you can and cannot do and who can or who cannot do it.
Michael, I buy into your argument completely on your side, but let me play devil's advocate for just a moment, because I would imagine that there's people out there that are thinking this themselves. Maybe they are already in a regulated industry, lawyers, accountants, other practitioners, service providers are regulated. Why not the religious practitioners? Why not religious organizations?
Well, that is very much the argument that she is using. And of course, it's a wrong argument. It's a wrong-headed argument, because if you look at the sectors that we've mentioned, lawyers, accountants, doctors, there is an existing body of knowledge or even practice, if you're a doctor, that you must know and understand very well in order to be able to function at that level. It's a known body of law, it's an agreed body of law, or it's a known body of knowledge. Of course, when you come to faith, faith is by definition fluid. And our constitutional court, in interpreting your right to religious freedom, which, by the way, is guaranteed by the Constitution, it is also a right, incidentally, which is not given by the state, it's simply recognized by the state, simply by virtue of the fact that you are a human being, and your right to believe what you want to believe is very much integral to your human dignity. So faith is fluid. The fact that there are, as I understand it from a bit of research I did, in some estimates, 40,000 Christian denominations in the world is a pretty good indication that we do not agree on the same interpretation of the scriptures. And how can you therefore regulate something where there is no particularly defined absolute body of knowledge? And secondarily, if you did, the Constitutional Court has ruled that even if what you believe is bizarre, irrational, illogical, incapable of any form of scientific proof, it is still protected by religious freedom. You can believe in the man in the moon if you want to. So how can you regulate that? How can you actually define that body? And therefore, it's pretty obvious, and I think anybody who's listened to that argument would quickly agree, that no, you can't regulate it, not the faith element. But you can, of course, and this is what has happened, and we're all happy with that. There are plenty of regulations which apply to the faith communities. I mean, Mark, you run a church, so you will have, and you employ people. There are employment contracts, there are safety regulations, there are building codes, there are all sorts of things. And of course, non-compliance is not an option. If the law says you have to do something, you have to do it. But the state cannot intervene and regulate when it comes to what you can and cannot believe. That it cannot do.
Oh, Michael, I mean, so much what you say is so true and experientially realistic. I mean, you see that on the ground, just the difference in understanding of scripture, even amongst the Christian community, let alone other faiths. It's such an expensive task. One wonders how they might wrap their minds around it. It even seems bizarre to get started. But I'm just thinking in terms of the academic process that I've gone through myself. When you think of things like peer review and peer review committees and the idea of subjecting yourself to the academy, that's intended to root out and stamp out compliance issues and misguided theology issues and such. Is that not a good thing? Isn't it a good idea for the prophets of doom to be caught before they spray? Isn't it a good idea for us to at least be be subject to authorities above us. And again,
Yeah, we're all subject to.
I'm playing devil's advocate because I'm a Baptist, and
No, I understand.
Baptists are fully autonomous. The idea of having a bishop or a pope above us, really kind of is beyond our theological understanding. We're local church autonomous, but I do understand the concept of review. Is this not a place to start?
Well, you're absolutely right in as much as it's very good to educate your calling. But I think, and if you ask religious practitioners, pastors, imams, whoever they are, what is it that actually brought you to do what you do? Was it an academic qualification, or was it a sense of calling? The answer in almost every case is it was a calling. And yes, you should obviously educate your calling. But here's the problem. Whenever the state gets behind a particular ideology, let's say that there is this peer review mechanism or this committee appointed. Well, the first thing you have to ask yourself, of course, is, well, who appoints them? And the answer would be the state. So they are a state appointed body, therefore, no matter whether they consist of religious leaders or not. And what about people who disagree with them or who may not feel represented by them? How do you deal with that? This is the problem. Whenever the state, you can look at all of human history, has put its authority, and bear in mind that the state carries the kind of like the sword, right? I mean, ultimately it carries the force. Whenever it's put its force behind any ideology or religious position, it always ends horribly for those who are not on the in-group. You can look at that when it came to the Reformation, to which we all, as evangelical Christians, Protestants, owe our roots, so to speak. They were ruthlessly persecuted by the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And curiously, when that took root, the Lutheran faith, and along came another group called the Anabaptists, which is probably part of your heritage, they were persecuted as ruthlessly, if not more ruthlessly, by the Lutherans, who obviously hadn't learned the lesson that you shouldn't persecute people for their faith. The Puritans did exactly the same thing when they fled religious persecution in the UK and they went to America. And another group of pesky Quakers came into their territory. They executed them by hanging. So you can see, as soon as the state puts its power behind any authority of religion or what have you, and you have an in-group and an out-group, it's going to end horribly for someone. And it's going to end horribly for people who obviously aren't in that group. The other thing, and it's the very important legal construct, is that our courts have something called the doctrine of entanglement, which means that they will avoid getting involved in religious disputes, particularly internal disputes, particularly doctrinal disputes. And the state should do the same. This is not an area where the state should get involved. And it is certainly not an area where you should have to have a license granted by some body appointed by the state, which will decide whether you can or cannot preach or teach the gospel.
Michael, again, I'm in full agreement with what you're saying. I do personally have one concern as I look at religion in South Africa, as I look at the news, as I look at a number of very high-profile people who have come into South Africa, and I've seen what I would describe maybe as a health, wealth, and prosperity influence in teaching. I've seen some manipulation, particularly amongst vulnerable people groups, with regard to extorting money out of them or wringing money out of them. Will the CRL's system prevent that kind of fraud and corruption? Is that what they're aiming at?
But if there is fraud and corruption, you're talking about criminal acts. So, for example, if you're taking in money and you're just pocketing it and you're not paying taxes, then that would be a crime. If you're promising people something and you're not delivering it, but you're taking money for it, that would be a crime. So, as I said, many of these things are dealt with through criminal or other law. But you then have to ask yourself the question, so do you want the state to get involved in deciding when somebody is or is not financially gullible? Or like, where does gullibility end and faith begin, or vice versa? Because there will be some people who would say, look, if you're giving any money to an unseen God, then that's gullible. That's something that you shouldn't do. Maybe you shouldn't be allowed to do. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is that you cannot decide for an individual where they should or should not put or invest the money that is their money. I mean, I know people who've literally sold houses and given them to the church, or sold cars and given them to the church, and they've been wonderfully blessed as a consequence. So, just because you do something which might seem completely crazy, they would say, well, I was inspired to do it by faith. I believe God called me to do it. They're entitled to that belief, and they're entitled to take that course of action. And if we then say, well, then the state can sort of set some parameters to this, well, where does it end? I think another very good question, if you want to get a little bit more theological, is the story of the Lord Jesus Christ, and he's sitting in the temple and he's watching people put money into the treasury. And a little woman comes along and she casts in her entire livelihood. Does Jesus say, stop, this is abuse? No, he actually commends her for her faith. And he then points to other people who are simply giving for show. Was he wrong in that? Was he encouraging the abuse of vulnerable people in that? Well, he was sinless and spotless and perfect. So the answer must be no. So how do you deal with that? In other words, how do you as the state decide when you should or should not intervene? I believe that the less the state has to do with the actual practices of people and what they do with their own money, the better. But obviously, if there's crime involved, if there's some form of deception involved, then yes, there should be some regulation. And I also believe, of course, and this is what the law says, that if you are taking in money as a religious organization, there are certain registrations that you have to go through. Like you should have a bank account, you should be paying your taxes. If you're an NPO, or registered, many of the regulations now say that you have to produce accounts and that type of thing. So yes, let's have financial accountability, but let's be very careful that we don't intervene where this is not necessary, particularly if we're stopping people from doing what they might believe to be a sincere, faith-motivated act of giving.
Look, enough devil's advocate, Michael. I'm in agreement with everything that you've said. And I firmly believe that there's enough laws and regulations in South Africa to hold people properly to account. I just think of the church that I'm involved in and just how much compliance actually goes into running a functioning church. There is a large amount of red tape already. We don't need any more, but we certainly don't need anything that will ultimately impinge our right to our religious freedom. And that really is your wheelhouse. So I have one other question. This really will be aimed at pastors and members that are concerned, like I am, when they hear that the CRL might be wanting to impinge on their freedoms. What does 4SA see as the possible implications of this proposal for the faith communities in South Africa?
Well, you just simply have to look at examples of nations where state regulation is already in place. So, for example, in Rwanda, it was reported in August last year that over 9,800 prayer houses and over 7,000 illegal churches have already been shut down. When we look at Angola, in Angola, government passed legislation whereby if you want to open a church, you have to show that you have 100,000 signed up members before they will actually allow you to register legally. And you also have to have a state-approved academic qualification. Over 2,000 churches have been shut down in Rwanda. In fact, 46 mosques, apparently, according to reports, have been shut down in Angola, rather. So this is, I think, what you can expect. And I believe that this is fundamentally in conflict with our constitutional right to religious freedom. That is our right to believe what we want to believe, to live it out, to express it, to assemble together, to associate together freely without fear of sanction by government or, frankly, anyone else. And I believe, yes, we must be law-abiding. And yes, laws must be properly enforced. If abuses are taking place, enforce the laws. The CRL, by the way, has all the power it needs to actually do that. It can refer any matter that it sees that is problematic to the relevant state authority and recommend the action that they take. So we do not need more regulation, least of all if that regulation will start to infringe and impose upon what people believe. You're free to believe what you want as long as it doesn't harm somebody else.
Michael, thanks for the chat today. I really appreciate it. And do please continue to both represent us as the church before the state, but also keep us informed, lobby us when needs be, tell us where to go in order to get involved with this ongoing and rolling discussion. I do want to take a moment, anybody that's made it this far in the discussion, to point them to the 4SA website. That's forza.org.za. And on that website, you can sign up for a newsletter, which is informative. You can see a lot of video material. There are plenty of articles, and you guys do a great job of both informing, but also keeping us abreast of what's going on. There's also your social media channels. I know there's YouTube and there's Facebook. Thank you so much for the work that you guys do, and strength to your arm as you do it.
Thank you, Mark. Just one small correction.
Sure.
It's FORSA, not ZA.
You see.
Freedom of Religion, South Africa.
FORSA.org.za. Thanks, Michael. I will put that
There
in
we go.
the show notes. Every blessing to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Look forward to the next time.